My name is Hope Davis, and I will be talking about the role of history in communication according to the Pilgrim's Regress. The Pilgrim's Regress by C.S. Lewis, not to be confused with Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, is a spiritual allegory that outlines the philosophical and faith journey of John, who represents Lewis's thoughts. John abandons his Christian faith from childhood because it is based on his fear of the landlord, who represents God, and the overwhelming collection of rules associated with him. He goes off in search of his idea of joy, which is represented as a beautiful island, of which he catches rare glimpses of throughout the story. In this book, Lewis translates many of the thoughts and schools of ideas that he encountered during his own life into characters that John encounters during his journey. After interacting with multiple beliefs and ideas, John travels back to Christianity, and at the end of the book, he makes a regress, traveling back to where he started, this time with a faith based on experience instead of fear. Lewis uses John's interactions with the multiple characters to demonstrate which communication habits that are beneficial, as well as which habits to avoid, and how they all play a part in becoming a better communicator. In my paper, my main theme is to show how to become a more mature communicator. I analyze the characters that show both immature and mature habits in communication, and I discuss how John responds to each of them and how both habits play a role in our own communication. In this speech, I will be covering the characters that are associated specifically with the power of history. I will discuss the importance of finding a balance when considering history for our own communication purposes on a broad and personal level. The first example of an immature disregard of history is shown by John's interaction with Sigismund Enlightenment. Lewis uses Sigismund as a representative of Sigmund Freud, who had several different views that differed from Lewis, especially when it came to Christianity. John mistakes Sigismund for a character that he met early in the story named Mr. Enlightenment, who represents 19th century rationalism, and who happens to be Sigismund's father. When John mentions his earlier encounter with Mr. Enlightenment, Sigismund's views of his father are soon revealed in his response. "That must have been my father, old Mr. Enlightenment. He is a vain and ignorant old man, almost a Puritanian, and we never mention him in the family. I am Sigismund Enlightenment, and I have long since quarreled with my father." With this quote, Lewis is showing how the old rationalism replaced the psychoanalysis that is associated with Freud. Instead of acknowledging the past in the context that his father experienced, Sigismund instead sees himself as a replacement and completely ignores his father's history. But in doing so, he doesn't realize that he is making the same communication habits as his father. In a footnote of the Pilgrim's Regress, Lewis wrote that Freudians psychologize those who disagree with them instead of refuting their opponents with reasoning and advice. Another footnote about Mr. Enlightenment says that Lewis sees the old rationalism as an excessive reliance on unaided reason. Instead of explaining why he disagreed with his father, Sigismund continues to insult him and discuss how old-fashioned he is. Little does he realize that his father had a similar experience when he met John earlier in the story. John tried asking him some sensible questions, and instead Mr. Enlightenment kept commenting on how young he was and how he had such a lack of intellect because of his age. But Sigismund refused to acknowledge the history of his father's ideas, so he was unable to notice that he had the same weaknesses. A second example of an immature disregard for the past is shown by the clevers, and Lewis uses them to represent the literature of the 20s, or, according to one of the notes he wrote in the margins, the gibberish literature of the lunatic 20s. These characters share their ideas through individual songs that they perform for John. And when John doesn't understand one of the songs because it literally sounds like gibberish, one woman responds to him by saying, "That is because you are looking for beauty. You are still thinking of your island. You've got to realize that satire is the moving force of modern music." The clevers soon prove to have the same weaknesses as Sigismund Enlightenment when it comes to their reasoning. They focus on ridiculing and criticizing people with differing views. John tries to offer them some common sense, but they become very angry and abusive verbally by calling him names and physically by throwing things at him. Their songs and reactions follow the same patterns as the Enlightenments with their communication. Instead of giving John evidence and reasoning for his ideas, they immediately attack him and denounce his thoughts and calling him old-fashioned. An example of a mature approach to history is shown through an old hermit whose name is History. Unlike most of the characters of the book, History actually has experience to back up his facts. He tells John, "I have been in these countries 1,000 times, for in my young days I was a peddler, and there is no land I have not been in." History acknowledges the thoughts of people who disregard the past, like Sigismund and the Clevers. He says, "They think that the landlord works like the factories in Claptrap, inventing every day a new machine which supersedes the old. As machines are among the very few things they do know something about, they cannot help thinking that everything is like them." But this leads them to two mistakes. First of all, they have no conception how slowly the landlord acts, the enormous intervals between these big changes in his type of picture. And secondly, they think that the new thing refutes and cancels the old, whereas in reality, it brings it to a fuller life. There are also patterns found throughout history that help us explain our own habits on a broad level. This is one of the ways that history brings the present to a fuller life. After John speaks to each character, he reflects on his experience and looks for ways to apply it to his own life. And Lewis did the same thing whenever he was reading his books. He didn't read for the sake of reading, but he studied, and he came back to the same books years later and often found mistakes that he never noticed before. And he admits to accepting all these different philosophies at first. In the afterword of the Pilgrim's Regress, Lewis says, "For I have myself been deluded by every one of these false answers in turn, and have contemplated each of them earnestly enough to discover the cheat. It is fools, they say, who learn by experience. But since they do at least learn, let a fool bring his experience into the common stock, that wiser men profit by it." This is part of the reason why he wrote the Pilgrim's Regress, so that his readers could avoid making those same mistakes. According to a study by Adam Barkman, Lewis had a deep respect for history, but at the same time, he was able to refrain from getting stuck in the past. Barkman wrote, "When heavenly desire is transformed by the theological virtue of hope, the Christian becomes the ultimate lover of the future, who at the same time finds great value in the past in order to transform the present." And this goes back to what history was trying to teach John. He was teaching him the role of history in a broad sense as it relates to Christianity, but his words also apply to us as communicators. In order to become more mature communicators, it is important to regularly reflect on what has happened in the past. And doing this helps us become more aware of our communication habits, both good and bad. This allows us to be better prepared for tracking our improvements, as well as avoiding our mistakes of the past. Both Sigismund and the Clevers were not willing to admit the possibility that they still had something to learn. Instead, they focused all their attention on building up their own ideas and making everyone else's seem inferior or irrelevant. Whereas other characters, like History, took the time to listen to John and actually had experience to back up his beliefs. By disregarding the past, Sigismund and the Clevers became unaware of the old patterns they were repeating in their responses to John. Acknowledging our past helps others better understand who we are as communicators today. It is just as important, however, that we refrain from getting stuck in the past and our mistakes. Like the character History wisely pointed out, we should reflect on the past with the goal of enhancing the present. Identifying this balance allows us to have better control over our own communication habits, helping us to become more mature communicators.